Brethren, once again, I want to thank you for allowing me to present a lesson and for entrusting me with these topics that are so important. Hopefully, the person who requested this hasn't gone through bankruptcy yet. 6 years, still waiting on an answer, right? What I want us to do before we even start is I want us to read the scripture here, Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 11. And I want us to do that because it lays down some principles in the Old Testament. This is not binding on the New Testament. I realize that. But I want us to read that so that we can get an idea of what God considered regarding this in the Old Testament, where he established not just his people, but his government. It was a government that he had established there with the Jews, and he put. And we're going to discuss different aspects of this. But it says. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, Moses is getting ready to pass on to die, and he's going to repeat to the people things that are really important, things that are needed, things that they need to be reminded of, things that are inspired by God for him to do. And so let's go ahead and read that regarding the sabbatic year. It says, at the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a remission of debts. This is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. Now, I want you to notice there what he calls it. He calls it the Lord's remission. So it's going on, it says, from a foreigner you may exact it, but your hand shall release whatever of yours is with your brother. However, there will be no poor among you, since the Lord will surely bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, if only you listen obediently to the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all this commandment which I am commanding you today. And I notice that he puts a qualification on there. Some people say, because in a moment he's going to be talking about the poor, it's important that we understand he's talking about there will not be any poor, but he says if you do this, and the fact of the matter is that they didn't. And so there were poor among them. And for the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised you, and you will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow. And you will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. If there's a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother. But you shall freely open your hand to him, and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. Beware that there is no base thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of remission, is near, and your eye is hostile toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. You shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land. And he goes on, but that's sufficient for that. And so I want us to get a couple of things out here, and I'm going to be pointing them out again as we go along. The Lord cared about the poor, and he says, you know what? I don't want you to harden your heart. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Let me see, we got 7 years. We just passed it, so I can make the guy pay up in 7 years. put the squeeze on him in about the third or fourth, fifth year, and he'll pay me. By the 6th year, 6.5 year, you're like, I'm going to lose this money. And so your heart will get hard. God says, don't do that. Don't do that, because he's going to pray, and I will listen to him. I want you to understand that. I will listen to him. I know what you did. I know the reason you did it, and I'm listening to him. He says, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it for you. I will bless you. Let him keep that. Let him forget that. I will bless you, okay? And that's important. So let's go ahead. Bankruptcy is it's an embarrassing choice, plainly. Nobody likes to, very few people like to think about bankruptcy or going bankrupt. Nobody likes to do it, but like I said, some here may have been affected by it already. They may have had to declare it in the past, or they may be dealing with it right now or considering it right now. And it is something important. It's a reality of life. The fact is, people, even though we are stewards of money and we should be godly stewards of money, the fact is that sometimes things happen that we can't control. Now, I'm going to say this, and I'll probably say it several times during the study. God never excuses laziness. He doesn't excuse people lying. He doesn't excuse people saying they're going to do something and then their word being worthless. He never excuses that. And oftentimes when we think about bankruptcy, that's what we think about, that the person's a deadbeat. The person is not interested in paying, never was interested in paying, just playing the system. But there's a lot of different causes for bankruptcy, and we'll touch on those. I dare say that, many bankruptcies would be better handled a different way. But the fact is, the reality is, I was telling Bill, there are some situations, we'll discuss those as we go along. And it is something you can recover from. God permitted it in the Old Testament, like we just read. And it was one of the reasons was to control unscrupulous lenders, what we would call payday loans today. I hope I don't get in trouble. What we would call usury, or what we would call delete that part. What we would call abusive interest in lenders today. It was to free the poor from the debt that they had accumulated, and to bless the lender. It was so that the lender would do something good, and God says, I'll bless you, I'll take care of you, don't worry about that. And again, it was called the Lord's release or the Lord's remission. It was something that God says, you can put my name on it. And so it wasn't something that was considered sinful. I want to talk about the etymology just for a moment, just for one slide. The etymology for bankruptcy. The word it means is a state of being unable to pay just debts, and I underline just debts. Or to meet obligations. That's from the 1560s in English, and it's from the Italian bancarotta. Literally means a broken bench. In Spanish, it's a similar meaning, and it's a reference to the banca, which was the bench or the money lender's shop. They would often sit on a bench or in a what we would call, like they have at the fair and stuff like that. They would have those open tents, and they would have their benches there to loan money. And rota, which means broken or defeated or interrupted. And I don't know how real this one is, but there was I saw it several times. So it's said to have been called from an old custom of actually breaking the bench of the bankrupts, but more than likely it's probably just figurative. That it doesn't do a whole lot of good to break somebody's bench. They just build another one. But it references insolvency or insolvent person from the 1530s, and that was like 30 years before it was referenced generically for all things. It was something referring to somebody who couldn't pay their debts. I want to get to some facts about bankruptcy that we should keep in mind when we think about bankruptcy. You know, it's a general term, and so I may be thinking about one aspect of bankruptcy, and you may be thinking about a different aspect of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is a legal way to force lenders to eliminate or reduce debt. And you need a lawyer for that in the United States. And there's several kinds. There's Chapter 11, which is a reorganization for business. You hear about J.C. Penney or Sears or some of these other places that are going into bankruptcy. That doesn't mean they're liquidating everything right away, reorganizing, and the purpose of that is to come out the other side and be able to continue a smaller, more fit, whatever, but it's to reorganize. And there's Chapter 13, which is has a 3-year payout. Now these vary slightly state to state and stuff, but. And that's more or less for the middle class. Oftentimes when somebody goes into bankruptcy, and I've known a couple of, or maybe probably 3 or 4 people that have gone into bankruptcy, and this is what they've had, Chapter 13. And what they do basically is they take and they reorganize all their debt. And the court tells all the creditors, you guys, this is what we're going to agree to. And they take all this, all your income and stuff. And then there's Chapter 7, which is debt cancellation, and that's for the very rich or the very poor are the ones that use that. And the middle class doesn't use that as much, for whatever reason. And Chapter 7, from what I understand, was actually modeled after the Old Testament system of bankruptcy. Matter of fact, they gave it the number Chapter 7, not because there were 6 previous chapters, but because of the 7-year remission that God had given. And so they gave it, back in the 1930s when they came up with all this, they gave it Chapter 7 as a reference to the 7 years. And people, that's the one that people usually think we're talking about when somebody talks about bankruptcy is just get rid of your debts and move on. It's going to be a black mark on your credit for 7 years. It'll be recorded. It'll be on your credit for 7 years, but. Don't be surprised if you go through bankruptcy or somebody goes through bankruptcy to start getting credit applications immediately because of that whole thought. Okay, well, he can't go bankrupt for another 6 years or 7 years, so it'll be good for, the debt will be, you can't get rid of it, so for those 6 or 7 years. So you'll start getting things right away if you go through bankruptcy. It doesn't mean things are well in your life. It means that there are people who are willing to take advantage of any situation. IRS income taxes that are more than 3 years old can be wiped out, but all other taxes stay. No other taxes are wiped out. Student loans are not forgiven in bankruptcy. You can prevent loss of your home in Chapter 13 by paying out the back payments over 3 years. And so what you have to do is you have to keep your payments current, plus you've got a 3-year program where you are paying whatever is owed. So whatever 4 years, or 4 months, or 6 months, or whatever you're behind, 3 months, you got to pay that all back. And if you miss a payment, you're in trouble. Don't miss a payment. And so it's really important that somebody who's going through that be honest about what they're making, and if there are changes, they need to go back to the court and tell them. Sometimes a debt relief plan produces a better result than bankruptcy. There are debt relief plans out there where counselors, a lot of them that follow biblical principles, and what they do is they're authorized also to talk to credit card companies and debtors and stuff, and they talk to these people, and they tell them, look, you've got some problems. It looks like it's going to be heading to bankruptcy if we don't get this straightened out, and they're able to wheel and deal and produce a system whereby you pay people what you owe them. A lot of companies, when they do this, they'll reduce their interest rate as opposed to raising it to the penalty rate, which we'll talk about that in just a moment. bankruptcy isn't always the right choice. It will not cure income deficiency. If you're not making a lot of money before bankruptcy, you won't be making a lot of money after bankruptcy. That's something you got to fix on your own. You've got to get a second job. You got to do whatever. Get something that you're better qualified for, whatever. It doesn't cure that income deficiency, and it doesn't cure the opposite, the other side of the coin, excess spending. That's a bad habit that people have that we often associate with bankruptcy, and it's true. Many of the people who go into bankruptcy, they have a habit of spending what they don't have, and so then they get a credit card, and then they relieve the pressure a little bit, and then they got a problem with that one, and it's a vicious circle. I helped someone with their problems, and I basically took over their and I'm not a counselor or anything, but they were so desperate. They had like four loans out there. One of them was charging 535% annual percentage rate. 535%. Several were, a couple of them were 300 and something percent. But they just it was spontaneous combustion. They were just drowning. It will not cure excess spending. You've got to control that, your spending. You've got to learn to live within your means. Whether you're the one at fault for whatever the situation, the fact is you're going to have to make some tough choices. And it will not solve business problems. You got a business that's not working out right for whatever reason. You're not competitive, or it's not something that people are looking for, or whatever. It won't solve all those problems. So it doesn't solve everything. But bankruptcy stops you from being harassed by lawsuits and debt collectors. They put a stop to that immediately. You stop getting those calls, those hounding calls every single day. Whenever you get them, every 2 days or every week or whatever. And the objective is to get free of debt in bankruptcy. That's the purpose of bankruptcy. It's not to blow off your creditors and keep on moving. It is to get out of debt and become responsible once more. You have to make sacrifices. The court may say, okay, you don't need 2 cars or 3 cars or whatever you got, the 2 cars and the truck you got, or you may not need, that Beanie Baby collection, whatever they may say you don't need that, you need to sell it, and if Grandma gave it to you, well, feel sorry about that, but you got to sell it, you got to get rid of it. In order to pay off your debts. And so you will make sacrifices in bankruptcy. And a lot of people, this is a very common thing, and the judges know it, and the lawyers know it, and the creditors know it. People lie in order to keep something hidden from the courts. They'll lie. You get in big trouble for that. Big trouble. So, these are just the facts. Bankruptcy is humbling, all right? But humility is a good thing. It can help you set the foundation for the rest of your life. You will be humbled. You will look at yourself and you say, man, I'm a slug, people are going to look at you and say, yeah, you were in bankruptcy. It is a humbling thing, and you got to recognize it. But a lot of successful people have gotten past bankruptcy. Abraham Lincoln 2 times, Ulysses Grant, Thomas Jefferson. Those are just some of the leaders. I could say Donald Trump has been in bankruptcy and has overcome bankruptcy. Dave Ramsey, a lot of us know Dave Ramsey, the guy who helps pay, manage your money. He was in bankruptcy, and that's one of the things that helped him to the things he learned. Walt Disney, of Mickey Mouse fame, Rembrandt, the painter before last names were popular. Mark Twain, Henry Ford, Joe Louis, J.C. Penney. I could go on and I could go through the rest of the hour just naming people, sports figures who made millions and have had to file bankruptcy, actors by the boatload, politicians. You could go, just name after name after name, and most of them you would know. But the important thing is that people can move forward after a bankruptcy. It's not the end of the world. In the Old Testament, the Lord permitted bankruptcy to free people from mammon, basically, from the rich of the world, from debt, and it was so that they could serve Him better. He worked with the lender, the creditor, and the borrower. Now, God lays down some principles about that, but a lot of people, especially in Jesus' day, and even till today, believe that if someone was prosperous, it was evidence that he was a good person. And they'll say somebody like Abraham or something like that God has prospered them. David, who was, became a king, became very prosperous. His son Solomon became very prosperous. God says He blessed them with that. And God does bless some people. In the past, He's blessed them, and probably still does if you follow principles. But the Scripture shows that evil people also become wealthy. Ecclesiastes talks about that. Proverbs talks about that. We see examples, throughout the Scripture. Abigail's husband was wealthy, and he wasn't a nice guy at all. He was a fool. And likewise, people believe that being destitute means that somehow you're hiding sin. You've got sin in your life, and so God is not. In other words, they try to put tie your spirituality to your finance, and you have to be real careful in the judgment because neither case provides that evidence of a person's spiritual condition. You can be very faithful Christian and have something happen where you may end up in bankruptcy court, or you could be a nastiest person in the world and make a ton of money. And so the important thing that we need to do, and I could go a whole lesson on this last point. We need to pursue God's ways, God's righteousness, and seek true spiritual wealth. That's what we need to do. And so that even if you're poor here on earth, that you have true riches in heaven. That should be our focus. And then somehow, whatever happens here on earth, we need to be careful that we're following God, and that's what we're doing. And whatever happens. We do the best that we can, but sometimes, like I said, anyway, we have to be careful about judging somebody, say, you were bankrupt. That means, you didn't manage your money right. Or the sad thing is that probably most of the people that do get into bankruptcy is because they have mismanaged something. But there's a lot of cases where they haven't. Old Testament principles, that's what I want to lay down first, because that's what we need to apply. Like Bill said, and like has been pointed out, and probably the reason that not a lot of people have given this lesson is it's not even addressed directly as such in the New Testament. What God does is He lays down the principles, but like as mentioned, God allowed it every 7 years. And again, that's not to excuse laziness. Okay, God does not allow for laziness. Go with me to Psalm, and I want us to look at Psalm chapter 10 and verses the 10th Psalm. And verses 4 and 5, and there's many passages that we could look at. I just wanted to see that. Notice what God says in Psalm 10, verses 4 and 5. The wicked in the haughtiness of his countenance, does not seek him. All his thoughts, are, there is no God. His ways prosper at all times. Your judgments are on high, out of his sight. As for all his adversaries, he snorts at them. And so, you know, and so, you know, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10, Paul says, you know, he's referencing these principles when he says, tells the Thessalonians, he says, that's, you guys didn't get this from us. He says, if somebody will not work, neither let him eat. All right? And so God does not excuse laziness. And the purpose of, even if a lazy person takes advantage of bankruptcy, they're still in trouble with God. All right? They still need to resolve this whole laziness issue. And so God doesn't excuse laziness. And then, as was mentioned previously, it's called the Lord's remission. He allowed this bankruptcy in the Old Testament, and he put his name on it. The Lord's remission, or the Lord's release, some translations say. And so, and God tells the lender, don't have a bad heart about this. You're taking the loss. I will bless you. I'll take the loss for you. You know, is what he's in essence saying. I'm going to bless you, and you're not going to miss that amount of money because I authorized it. And so, you know, God cares about both the lender and the borrower. Additionally, every 50th year, the year of Jubilee, it got even bigger. Everyone's land was returned to them, and so I sold you my land, my family land, and I you know, because I was so broke, so destitute, so whatever kind of problems I had, that I had to sell the land. Every 50th year it goes back. God says, don't worry about that. I'll take care of that. I gave it to you. I want you to get it back every 50th year. You wasted it for 49 years or whatever, or you lost control of it, whatever, but every 50th year it gets straightened out. All debts are forgiven, again, year of Jubilee, the 50th year, and all debt slaves were released. Sometimes you had to, you were taken to court and you had to become a slave to pay off some debt. Or sometimes you would have to give your child to be a slave, and that would happen because of debt. And God says every 50th year, the year of Jubilee, all of that gets reset. All of it goes start back at the beginning. It's not going to get any worse than that. It's not going to last worse than that. And there's some more principles in the Old Testament. In Proverbs 22, as long as we're in Psalm now, what was that? Let me get back here. That was the problem. I was like, Psalm 10. It's Proverb 10. I'm like, that doesn't sound right. I don't know why I included that one. Let's get back to, anyway, so let's go and read Proverbs 10. I hope you can edit this thing. Proverbs 10, verses 4 and 5. Poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Boy, that makes sense now. And verse 5, he who gathers in summer is a son who acts wisely, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who acts shamefully. All right, so that's the one about laziness. Let me get over here to Psalm 20. Proverbs, let me get back over here. 22, verses 26 and 27. Proverbs 22, verses 26 and 27. Do not be among those who give pledges. Notice what that means. I'll talk about that in a second. among those who become guarantors for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should you he take your bed away from under you? God says, basically saying, don't be a cosigner. If somebody, and we do that all the time. We'll do it for our children, for our brothers and sisters, or for our parents, or somebody that we're a close friend. We do it all the time. God says it's not wise at all. These guys are the lenders, they're professionals. If they look at everything and they say, we're not comfortable with this loan, they're going to tell that person, I need a cosigner. What are they basically saying? We don't trust that you're going to pay it back. The numbers don't work. And so therefore, we need somebody else that is going to cover for you. They're telling you that this loan is not a good loan. Now, the person may come through and pay everything the way they should, and that's all great, but we should not make a practice of it. It's not wise to become a cosigner. If you cosign for somebody, you need to ask yourself this question: can I afford that myself? Can I afford to make that payment without getting any of the benefits? Let's say it's for a car or something. Can I afford to keep making car payments? It happened to me when I was younger. I was a young guy. I wasn't even married yet, so that's how long ago it was. And I signed for my cousin, and he got tired of that car really fast. He didn't have any money in it. He had borrowed the down payment from another cousin. I had co-signed, and I was stuck with. I had just bought another car. I was stuck with 2 car payments for years because he didn't make the payments. You have to ask yourself, can I afford to make these payments? And it's not wise. God says don't do it. It's not wise. Why should you suffer the loss? Don't be a guarantor or make a pledge. In Psalm 37, now we go back to Psalm. Okay, Psalm 37, right here. This is the one that often is thought of when we think about bankruptcy. Psalm 37 and verse 21. The wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives. And so we often say, if you borrow and don't pay back, you're a wicked person. God says you're a wicked person, and wicked people do that. It's understood that a wicked person is going to borrow with no intention of paying back. All right, and so that applies. It just so happens that sometimes it applies to somebody who might want to pay back, and so we want to look at that. Going back to verse 27, the borrower becomes is a responsible person there, and so we want to follow these principles for the borrower. Now, the lender also, God lays down some principles for the lender. In Exodus chapter 22 and verses 25 to 27, we have time. Exodus 22. Now, they're just coming out of Egypt, all right, and they are going to be heading to the promised land there, and God wants them to realize something. In chapter 20, he gives what the 10 Commandments there on Mount Sinai, and he gives them a few other things here. Right there at the very beginning, God tells them something in Exodus 22, starting verse 25. He says, "If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest." Nehemiah, I believe it is, that was talking about that if you were charging 1% interest, you were supposed to return it when things when people were going back, 1%, and that was thought of as wrong. Today, easily people are charging a good A good rate would be like 5% or 8%. And 1% was too much. But he says, you shall not charge interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you are to return it to him before the sun sets, for that is his only covering. It's his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? It shall come about that when he cries out to me, what's that phrase there? I will hear him, for I am gracious. I'm full of grace. God says, if you're a lender and you loan to them, and let's say they give you their cloak as a pledge, get it back to them, all right, before the end of the day. That's it. If that's all he's got, then you cannot take away somebody's livelihood or basic necessities. In Leviticus 25, verses 35 through 37, again, the Levitical rules that he established for them. And then in Deuteronomy, again, he repeats these things. But in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 35 through 37, he says, now in case a countryman of yours becomes poor and his means with regard to you falter, then you are to sustain him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Do not take usurious interest from him, but revere your God, that your countrymen may live with you. You shall not give him your silver at interest, nor your food for gain. All right? He says, if somebody needs help, help them. That's what you need to do, help them. If you do loan them money, now, understand, it was not a sin to loan money. Or to borrow. Jesus talks about using the example about borrowers and stuff in Matthew chapter 5, in Matthew chapter several times in Matthew. He talks about that in Matthew when he talks about the parable of the talents. The guy said he tells the one talent man, you should have at least put it in the bank and gotten interest on it. God doesn't say that you can't loan money to people, but he says you got to be careful about that. Their whole attitude of wasting, and so he lays principles down for the lender and the borrower. We need to do that. Careful about that. We're stewards. Like I said, God doesn't address bankruptcy as such in the New Testament. There's no specific passages dealing with it. But there are principles of stewardship. And I want us to look at just a few. This isn't all of them. One of them, all money is God's money. Okay? And so what we do with our money, we are using it. We are stewards for God's money. It's not my money. Okay? I am using it as a steward for God's money. I mean, it's mine here to use at my discretion, using biblical principles. We have to remember that. 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul's writing to this young preacher, and he says to him, 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting verse 17, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. What's he talking about? Same thing we talked about earlier. Be righteous, seek God's righteousness, and store up. Take this monopoly money that you've got and turn it into real money in heaven. Take this fake stuff that you have and turn it into real treasure. And that's what he's saying. You can do that. You have an opportunity. There are brethren who are well off financially, and they do help brethren. We're going to talk about that just in a moment as one of the options that we have. And they don't really tell a whole lot of people because there's a whole lot of people who misuse their kindness, who would abuse them and go to them to solve their problems and never learn to be responsible. But there are brethren who help. They're following this exact same thing. And I've met some of them, and each case, it's always the same. We want to help, but we want to help people who really need it. We don't want people, and what happens is the minute the word gets out, it's a free-for-all for them. Consider, there are, let me get back over there. We need to keep our promises. That's the second principle. We need to keep our promises. First of all, understand that all money belongs to God, and everything we do with it, we're just stewards of God's money. And that helps some people because now I need to be responsible with this because it's not mine. I'm a steward for God. It's mine in the sense that I'm using it, just like I have the light, my light, let my light shine, but my light, I get it from God. All right? Everything that we get from God. We have to keep our promises. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 37, let your yes be yes and your no, no. When we say that we're going to pay somebody back, we need to mean it. We need to strive to do it. We need to do everything possible, including sometimes depriving ourselves of something in order so that we can pay it back. We need to be able to do that. Our yes has to be yes and our no, no. James chapter 5 and verse 12 says a similar thing. Let your yea be yea and your nay, nay. That's a biblical principle. And so if you're going to be borrowing, which is not a good idea to begin with, make sure that you're not doing it with the intention of stiffing somebody. We must all answer to God, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10. We all stand before the judgment seat of God so that we may be judged according to what we have done in the flesh, whether good or bad. And so we will answer to God for our irresponsible actions, short of being forgiven, where God writes it off. And in order to do that, you have to repent of what you're doing. So, we all have to stand before the judgment seat of God. And if you're, it's not just the people who are blatantly evil, those who are irresponsible, those who are lazy. God says, I've got something for you that you're not going to be happy with. Remember the power of prayer, that we can, when we see ourselves in a situation that we don't see the way out. I just can't see the way out. You pray, you let God handle it. Give it to God. Say, God, I'm willing to do everything that pleases you. I'm willing to serve you. I want to be responsible. I don't know how to get out of this. God, I'm putting this in your hands. And we need to trust that God really does care, and He really does want us to be good examples to the world. And we need to be content with what we have. Sometimes, especially with regard to bankruptcy, that's a big problem. People are not content with what they have, and so they seek more. I just got to have this. I just got to have this. I bought this because it's marked down. You've heard the joke that the man came home and he's like, he was all worked up. Why? My wife, she just buys everything marked down. And what do you complain about? I got some escalators that she just bought because they were marked down. And so it's it's a joke, but don't feel obligated to laugh. No, seriously, people sometimes just don't. Did you know, and we did a class on this years ago in Elgin, that and one of the case studies was that a man went and he started up a factory, I don't remember what it was, making shoes or something, in some land, third world country, and he couldn't keep employees. because they would earn their money, and they had enough money, and they would stop working at the factory there. And after talking to everybody and getting all, what he did was he started extending credit. And so the people started buying things on credit. Now they were obligated to go back to work. When you borrow, you are promising something that God doesn't promise. You're promising that you're going to be here 30 years from now making that last payment, or 10 years from now, or 8 years from now. You're promising somebody your future, and God doesn't even promise you that. He says your life is like a vapor. He says, I don't promise you tomorrow. We're promising something that God doesn't promise when we borrow. And so the story with this, people ended up borrowing all sorts of stuff to buy out of magazines, and to buy this and buy that. And they all got or all the ones that did get in debt ended up, they were faithful workers because they had to have that money. You're promising your future to somebody, and God doesn't even promise it. But you need to be content with what you have. If you have plenty, if you're prosperous, there's nothing to feel bad about. And if you don't have a lot, you cannot be wishing what somebody else has. Paul says, I have learned to be content in whatever situation I'm in. That's something that you have to learn. It's not something that automatically comes naturally, and that's a big problem for people who are in a situation where they're considering bankruptcy. Let me get to the alternatives to bankruptcy real quick before the conclusion here. There are alternatives to bankruptcy. Sometimes you say, I've got so many problems, I got to go bankrupt. Or somebody will tell you, just go bankrupt. There are alternatives. First of all, you got to know where your money's going, and so you need to set up a budget. And it has to be a written budget. You talk to people and they're like, yeah, I know where my money goes. I get paid, whatever, $100, let's say. Nobody gets paid $100, but let's just say for things, 400, 800, 1,000, whatever. I get paid $100, and I know I paid, I got to put gas in the car, and I got to this and that, and you say, okay, write it down. And they're like, oh, I already know, write it down. And it ends up almost every single time, it'll be like they'll have a good idea where $75 goes, $70, $80 goes, but there's that missing amount that you don't know where it's going. And it's just that chump change that ends up in the penny jar, or that you spent, at buying gum or whatever. You spent some kind of, you lost track of some money. Now, some of that, is normal, but some of that can be used with discipline. And so the first step in discipline is to write it down. Write it down. And if you can't answer for every penny, you've got to find out where it's going. You need to start paying attention. You need to know, because every penny you don't pay, somebody else is going to end up having to pay. And so you find out where your money's going, and you look at it and you say, okay, you know what? I don't need to do this every single week, or I don't need to eat out, every day. Maybe I still like eating out. I'm going to eat out twice a week or once a week or whatever. I don't need to, buy another coat. I've got 7 of them that I don't really want anyway. Can I get rid of them? Can I sell them off? Have a garage sale? Can I donate them? Can I do something with them? And you start thinking a whole different way. You have a plan on what to pay. I get $100 a week. I am going to have $5 discretionary money, and $95 I am going to pay. Now, normally I know I got to pay, gasoline, whatever, and I'm going to pay these bills before I start spending money. And it takes discipline, and people work their way out of debt that way. Other people have to consider and that's working on the spending. Other people have to consider their income, the opposite side, additional income, maybe, and dedicate it specifically, because now you're in debt. That's what you want to solve. You're going to dedicate that specifically toward reducing your debt. And so you're going to take that second job, or you're going to take that part-time job or whatever, and that money is going to be specifically toward working down that debt. And you might say it's not a whole lot. It's more than what you had, and you can work your way out of it. And then selling things that you have, like I said, sometimes you've got all this junk that you don't need. And if you go into bankruptcy, they're going to make you sell it anyway, and you might as well get rid of it, and that way you get to choose what you want to sell, and you use that money dedicated specifically. That's an alternative to bankruptcy. If you don't want to go through bankruptcy, there's ways to restructure the debt. Now we talked about the spending and the income. Now there's a way to restructure the debt itself. You can call up companies and tell them, I'm going to be blunt with you. I have some problems, and I may be heading toward. Remember, I told you the counselors say. You can say the same thing. I may be heading toward bankruptcy, and a lot of companies, not every company, a lot of companies will reduce their interest rates, but they won't do it if you don't ask them to. All right. Or you could talk to a counselor, and they know better how to do it. So where someplace might be resistant, they can get in there, and a lot of these places charge according on a sliding scale, according to what you're able to pay, and so they have debt restructuring plans where you pay it. I know a guy that went into one of these. It was 5 years. It was a 5-year plan. And it was whatever they restructured it, and whatever he could pay, and he had to be real honest about it and make the payment for 5 years. Whatever was left over at the end of 5 years, it would get wiped out. He wouldn't owe it anymore, and he failed to include one thing in there. Guess what? That wasn't included. So when the 5 years came up, his debt was wiped out, except for that one thing. I tell you, you got to be real careful about those things. And then you could ask your brethren for help. If it's a one-time thing, if it's something that happened to you that's not your fault, you can ask brethren for help. Maybe they can't solve all your problems, but they can help you. A lot of times, brethren, like I say, some brethren are able to help more than other brethren. Maybe they can help with a little bit, and maybe they can help with a lot. You ask the brethren. We're here to help each other, and I don't say, I kind of left that toward last, because you need to be responsible yourself. You need to be working things out yourself. Bankruptcy is a last alternative. Sometimes creditors force you into it. Sometimes, when you figure out your budget, you find out, hey, you know what? The late fees, the penalty interest, because a lot of times you're late on your payment on your credit card. Instead of saying, hey, this guy's having some financial, they'll jack up your interest more now. Penalty interest, they call it. And it'll be the maximum that they are allowed by law to charge you, and that goes up each time you look. Or sometimes NSF, you start writing checks that you don't have the money for, and you write the check to calm somebody down, and you say, it'll get there, in 2-3 days. You start check kiting, it's called, and boom, it bounces. Now you still owe the money. You got to pay the bank, NSF charge, and you got to pay them their fee for it. And so it just gets bigger and bigger. And when you start figuring all that out, and you say, it's to the point that it's mounting up faster than I can afford to even pay down the debt. you may be in a situation where you need bankruptcy relief, and or let's say circumstances demand it. A husband abandons his family, let's say, and now the wife is left with the responsibility of caring for the family, of working, going out and getting a job, and paying down old debt. Usually, the person who leaves with leaving you with a whole bunch of debt, and while you're starting in with an entry-level job, you're just not going to make any kind of leeway, and you may need bankruptcy for that. It's not the unforgivable sin. You're not going to go to hell because you've declared bankruptcy, but you sure don't want it to be the first choice. You want it to pay, and so therefore, this last point on here, even afterwards, if it's allowed. Now, you have to qualify that. If it's allowed, sometimes it's not allowed. All right, you should still try to repay what is owed. If it's a temporary thing and you got out of all this debt, you should try to keep some records just for yourself and say, you know what, I want to pay these. I want to pay that doctor, whatever amount I owed him. It wasn't a big amount, and it got wiped out, and he probably doesn't need it. He probably lives just fine without it, but I want to pay him back what I owe him because I did owe it to him. I want to pay back, the situation, whatever situation. You want to try to pay that back. If it's allowed, you need to talk to lawyers. Different places have different laws. Sometimes if you make one payment, you're on the hook now for the whole amount again. And so, you want to be real careful about that. You don't want to get yourself in trouble. So, that's what you want to do. Some situations require bankruptcy. The Bible lays down principles of responsibility. It doesn't prohibit it. It should never be our first option. Never, ever. We want to pay our debts. If I borrow money from somebody, I want to pay that person back or that organization back according to their terms. I'm borrowing it with my eyes open, and I need to pay it back. If I don't like their terms, pay it back and don't borrow from them again. Try to set up a situation where you have a rainy day fund or something like that where you can reach into it, or have somebody that can help you with that without borrowing. Let me get to the conclusion of Christian bankruptcy is it's almost an oxymoron. It almost a contradiction in terms, and many are hesitant, rightfully so, to declare it. You don't want to do that if you don't absolutely have to. But and there is a stigma attached to it, and not just you yourself, but other people have the same type of idea. It is easily abused, and we as Christians have to let our light shine in the world. We have to demonstrate that we are responsible, we are following godly principles. However, God did lay down principles that should be considered. There may be circumstances that warrant a bankruptcy for a Christian, and you're not a bad person because you declare it. That's the end. Any questions or comments? Hopefully I